Let's now consider crimes against public decency. Prostitution is an example of a crime against public decency. Prostitution generally means providing sexual acts for money or other kinds of compensation or things of value. Prostitution is illegal throughout the United States except in some Nevada counties. Now, those Nevada counties don't include the most populated urban areas in Nevada, Las Vegas and Reno. However, there are some counties that have legalized prostitution in Nevada, but otherwise in the United States, prostitution is illegal. But obviously, it still goes on. You know, the common expression is prostitution is the world's oldest profession. So the United States has taken an approach that we are going to keep this activity illegal, and we're going to punish it through the criminal law, and that's the best way to deal with prostitution, at least according to the United States. Now again, we're going to see in just a second some other strategies to deal with prostitution that will take a different approach. But in the United States, as I said, prostitution is generally illegal, with very few exceptions other than the ones we just mentioned. But then again, in practice, prostitution laws aren't often very stringently enforced. In some countries, prostitution is legal. In the Netherlands, where I take a group of students every summer, prostitution has been legal throughout the Dutch history. What has been illegal is to make money off of prostitutes. That is until recently, when the Dutch changed their laws so that brothels could be legally established. Nevertheless, prostitution itself, as I said, has been legal. The Dutch believe this is the best way to deal with prostitution because they can, for one, they know that prostitution will go on whether there's a law prohibiting it or not. And so therefore, if they remove the legal restrictions, they believe that the public authorities, such as the police, medical authorities, and others, can deal more directly with prostitution and prostitutes and diminish the other kinds of harms that may be associated with prostitution, such as the spread of communicable diseases, sexually transmitted diseases, assaults, human trafficking, a variety of other kinds of secondary crimes and problematic behaviors. So the Dutch want prostitution to be in the open so that their governmental authorities and others can view it, can perhaps more easily spot any kind of irregularities, but also so that everybody who's involved in prostitution, whether it's the prostitute or a customer or anyone else, can deal more openly with the police and other authorities if they have any problems. A third type of approach is the Nordic model. We see this in Scandinavian countries where instead of focusing their criminal punishments and laws on the prostitute, they instead focus on the customer, the John. So prostitutes will not be arrested, but their customers may be. The reason that these countries take this approach is they believe that there's a greater imbalance in power in favor of customers generally than towards prostitutes. So they feel that the law should protect the prostitutes And if there's going to be any prosecution, it should be of the customer instead. In some sense, all of these strategies are aimed at harm reduction. What is the best way to reduce the harms that are attached to prostitution? In the United States, we believe that the criminal law and criminal prosecution is the best way. It doesn't seem to be real successful, in all honesty. The Dutch system, as I said, is directed more at making things open so that there's more observation, and so there's a greater chance to more directly intervene when any kind of problematic behavior occurs. And the Nordic model says that the greatest need is to protect the prostitute, and so that the public authorities should be able to deal with her, most likely her, it could be a him, but most likely her, deal with her in a more direct fashion and not be concerned about questions of whether she should be arrested. Obscenity is another form of public indecency law. And obscenity generally is sexual expression that doesn't have any First Amendment protection. Now, this is sexual expression that deals with adults. We're going to see in the next presentation that there is a separate category that deals with child pornography. So things that are done with children may be more quickly prohibited than things that are done with adults. So we allow greater latitude for sexual expression involving adults. But nonetheless, the Supreme Court said there may be limits that are drawn, and those limits were promulgated in the Miller obscenity test. Miller was a case from 1973, and the Supreme Court laid out a definition of obscenity which features 3 parts that must be satisfied. So what I mean by that is, when we look at this PowerPoint and you see that there are steps 1, 2, and 3, the government, in order to bring a successful obscenity prosecution, must prove each one of these. So they must start with number 1, proceed to number 2, and then to number 3. If along the way we say no to any of these things, then the work is not obscene. So if we take a look at each of these steps, the first one says that the average person applying contemporary community standards finds the work taken as a whole to appeal to prurient interest. Now let's break that down a little bit. The Supreme Court said we should measure obscenity by the average person, not the person who is easily offended by sexual expression. And by sexual expression, I mean either speech or any kind of depictions in film, in books, exotic dance, whatever it may be, any way that you can express yourself sexually. So here the Supreme Court said that we must apply the average person standard. So not the person who is easily offended, and not the person who is offended by nothing, but somewhere in between. So the average person is supposed to apply contemporary community standards. That means the standards that the community will tolerate today. That's what's meant by contemporary, not what was okay or acceptable in the 1940s, but what is acceptable today. Furthermore, the Supreme Court said that even though it's interpreting the First Amendment, a national right, community standards will apply. Now, obviously, this is difficult in the internet age where you can't control as easily where your video goes. In the old days of film, you could control what city that film was shipped to. But today, obviously, with the internet, you can't. But nonetheless, the court said what may be acceptable in New York maybe isn't acceptable in the Bible Belt. So community standards would apply. So it's the average person applying contemporary community standards, looks at the entire work. So not just a page, not just a scene from a movie, but the entire work. And they ask, does this appeal to a prurient interest? What we mean by prurient is an unhealthy, excessive interest in sex. So not an interest in sex, that would be fine, but an unhealthy, lewd, lascivious, think in those terms, this kind of interest in sex. So the first question really boils down to, does the sexual expression appeal to a prurient interest? So if we say yes, it does appeal to a prurient interest, unhealthy interest in sex, we move on to the next step. So if we just had a centerfold, just nudity from Playboy, it's unlikely that anyone would find that, at least in today's standards, applying today's standards would find that that appeals to a prurient interest. Just merely an adult posing nude is not something we would say is an unhealthy interest in sex. So Playboy, even on the first step, wouldn't be considered obscene, and we'd be done with the ordinary Playboy centerfold. But if we found something that really did appeal to a prurient interest, that really did appeal to an unhealthy interest in sex, we'd next move on to step number 2. And here, the real question is that work, again, taken as a whole, not taken out of context, not just taking a single page, does it depict or describe in a patently offensive way sexual conduct? So the main test here, if the main test in step number 1 was whether it would appeal to a prurient interest, number 2 is, does that work represent a patently offensive depiction? So is it patently offensive? What we mean by patently, or some people say patently, offensive is it's clearly offensive. We don't have to look twice at it to know that it's offensive. So even under today's standards, mainstream, if there is such a thing, mainstream pornography would not be considered patently offensive to most people. It would have to be something that was really extreme. So maybe something that involved bestiality, or a whole variety of things we could imagine that would make people, as soon as they would see it, would say, oh, that's offensive. So it's, even today, under today's standards, quote, mainstream X-rated movies would probably not be patently offensive. We have, because of the internet, we have more people who have seen pornography than in the past. When the Miller test was written, you basically had to go to some theater, most likely some adult theater, to see pornography. Today, obviously, it's a keyboard click away. So we're probably more desensitized to pornography today. So it takes more to shock us. And that's really what patently offensive means. We are shocked instantly by this. So you can see under this test, we're giving a lot of latitude to sexual expression. But let's assume that the work appeals to a prurient interest. Let's assume that it's patently offensive. We get to the third prong, which is, even with these first 2 steps satisfied, we still have to ask, does it lack serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value? This is known as the SLAPS test. S for serious, L for literary, A for artistic, P for political, and S for scientific. So even if a work is prurient and a patently offensive, it may still have value. Maybe it's a graphic description of a sexual rapist crimes. This person describes all their rapes in very graphic ways. But nonetheless, if that work is being produced so that psychiatrists can understand how the mind of a serial rapist works, then it has scientific value. And so we would say it's still protected by the First Amendment. But if it does lack serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value, then we now have declared it to be obscene. If all 3 prongs are satisfied, it's obscene. And what that means is its distribution and production can be prohibited. That means the making of this obscene work and the distribution of it, the sale of it, the display of it, can also be prohibited. Now you might ask, what about the possession? There's a strange Supreme Court case out there from the 1970s that said we can't prohibit the simple possession of the personal possession of obscene materials. So it's only distribution and production, the making and distributing of obscene materials that can be outlawed by the state. Obscene materials have no First Amendment protection. So the Supreme Court has said this is a category of speech, a category of expression that is dangerous enough to society, that lacks enough value to society that we can outlaw it. But again, it has to, in order to be obscene, we have to prove all 3 parts of this test. The Supreme Court actually wanted more convictions under this test, because the old test used to say it had to be utterly without any value. But you can see here in Part 3 it has to lack serious value. But today, as I said, hardly anybody's going to be offended. It seems most people take the approach that if somebody wants to watch this, let them. And so it's going to be hard to prove, especially the second part, that it's patently offensive in today. So convictions are almost completely gone today. We haven't had a successful conviction for quite a long time.